Men, recognizing red flags isn't the challenge in modern dating. It's overcoming the psychological manipulation tactics that make you doubt, dismiss, or rationalize away the warning signs you're clearly seeing, keeping you invested in situations your instincts are telling you to leave. As certain women deploy specific psychological techniques that exploit your desire to be fair, your fear of being judgmental, and your hope that things will improve. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, smash that like and hype button, and drop a comment if you've ever ignored obvious red flags because someone made you feel like you were overreacting or being too harsh. Your experience might help another man recognize these manipulation tactics and trust his observations instead of being psychologically maneuvered into accepting unacceptable behavior. Trick 1. The trauma disclosure. Using past pain as shield against accountability. When she reveals traumatic past experiences early in the relationship, difficult childhood, abusive ex, mental health struggles, betrayal by previous partners, and then references this trauma whenever her problematic behavior is addressed, using her past pain as explanation for current bad behavior, an implicit demand that you be understanding rather than holding her accountable. She's not vulnerably sharing to build intimacy. She's strategically deploying her trauma as psychological shield that makes you feel guilty for having standards or pointing out problematic patterns, because challenging someone who's been hurt makes you feel like you're victimizing them again. What this reveals? This reveals manipulation through weaponized vulnerability. Genuine trauma sharing happens gradually as trust builds, comes with evidence of active healing work, and doesn't get used as excuse for harmful behavior. Strategic trauma disclosure happens early, gets referenced repeatedly when accountability arises, and serves to shut down legitimate concerns by making you feel cruel for not excusing behavior because of past pain. Notice the timing of trauma references. If her difficult past gets mentioned specifically when you're addressing concerning behavior, you bring up her lying and suddenly, you hear about her ex who made her afraid to be honest. You question her flakiness and learn about childhood that taught her to protect herself through distance. The convenient timing reveals trauma is being deployed as defensive weapon rather than shared as vulnerable truth. Watch whether trauma leads to growth or excuse-making. If someone genuinely working through trauma, they acknowledge when their past causes them to react poorly and take responsibility for managing their triggers rather than expecting others to accept bad behavior. If trauma is excuse for why she can't be reliable, honest, or respectful without any effort to change, it's manipulation tool rather than healing journey. Pay attention to whether you're allowed to have boundaries around her trauma responses. If every boundary you try to set gets countered with references to her past that make you feel guilty for having needs, the use of trauma to override your legitimate requirements reveals manipulation. Your boundaries don't re-victimize her. They're reasonable standards she's trying to escape through psychological guilt. The psychological trap. The trap works because it exploits your empathy and fear of being harsh. You don't want to be the person who lacks compassion for someone who's suffered. You don't want to be another person who hurts her after she's been hurt before. So you accept behavior you wouldn't tolerate from anyone else, telling yourself you're being understanding when you're actually being manipulated into accepting mistreatment through psychological guilt about her past pain. Trick 2. The future faking. Selling vision that never materializes. When she paints compelling pictures of your future together, detailed discussions about trips you'll take, life you'll build, experiences you'll share, goals you'll accomplish together, creating strong emotional investment in possibilities she describes vividly and enthusiastically. But these future visions never translate into concrete present-day actions, planning, or progress. She's not dreaming together with you about shared future. She's using future faking to keep you emotionally invested and hopeful while avoiding actual commitment or follow-through in the present, because future promises cost nothing while keeping you attached. What this reveals: This reveals strategic use of hope to maintain your investment without reciprocal commitment. Future faking exploits your natural tendency to stay invested in something you've mentally projected into having. Once you've imagined future with her, breaking up means abandoning not just present relationship but imagined future you've become attached to. She keeps painting new futures because each one resets your tolerance for present dysfunction. Notice the gap between future talk and present action. If she enthusiastically discusses moving in together someday, but won't commit to plans next month, if she describes trips you'll take, but won't book anything, if she talks about meeting each other's families, but avoids actual introduction opportunities, the contradiction between elaborate future and minimal present reveals future talk is manipulation rather than genuine planning. Watch what happens when you try to move from future talk to concrete planning. If discussing theoretical vacation someday is fine, but suggesting actual dates and booking flights makes her suddenly vague or hesitant, the resistance to converting future talk into present reality reveals the future vision was never meant to materialize. It exists only to keep you invested. Pay attention to whether future visions change or remain consistent. If she describes detailed future scenario that gets you excited and invested, then later describes completely different, incompatible future vision. The inconsistency reveals she's saying whatever maintains your interest in the moment rather than describing actual future she's working toward. The psychological trap. The trap works because humans are wired to complete what they've started and pursue what they've imagined. Once you've mentally invested in future with her, you experience cognitive dissonance, leaving that imagined future behind. She exploits this by constantly refreshing your future vision, giving you new scenarios to imagine and invest in, keeping you perpetually chasing futures that never arrive while tolerating present that doesn't match what you've been promised. Trick 3. The selective remorse. Apologies that change nothing. When she apologizes for problematic behavior, expresses remorse, acknowledges she was wrong, says she understands why you're upset, seems genuinely regretful about her actions. But the same behavior repeats within days or weeks, and this cycle of transgression apology repeat continues indefinitely without actual behavioral change. She's not genuinely working on issues. She's using apology as psychological reset button that allows her to continue problematic behavior by periodically expressing remorse that makes you give another chance, then another, without anything actually changing. What this reveals? This reveals strategic use of remorse performance to avoid consequences. Genuine apologies come with changed behavior. That's what distinguishes real remorse from manipulation. When someone repeatedly apologizes for same behavior without change, the apology serves to relieve your pressure for accountability while preserving her freedom to continue the behavior. She's learned apology is cheaper than change and sufficient to keep you accepting the pattern. Notice the emotional quality of her apologies. If apologies come with tears, vulnerability, self-criticism, promises to change, all the emotional indicators that make you feel she really gets it this time. But behavior doesn't change. The emotional performance reveals she's learned what apology performance maintains your tolerance, not that she's genuinely committed to change. Watch the time frame between apology and repeated behavior. If she apologizes for lying on Monday and lies again by Friday, if she's sorry for being distant this week, but distant again next week, the short cycle between remorse and repetition reveals apology was about managing your immediate reaction, not about preventing future occurrence. Pay attention to whether she addresses underlying causes. If apologies acknowledge specific action, but never explore why she keeps doing it or what she'll do differently, the surface-level remorse reveals she's managing your feelings about the symptom without addressing the disease. Real change requires understanding and addressing root causes, not just apologizing for symptoms. The psychological trap. The trap works because apology triggers your forgiveness instinct and hope for improvement. Each apology resets your assessment of the relationship. You forget the pattern of repeated behavior and focus on her current remorse, believing this time will be different. She exploits your capacity for forgiveness by using apology to continuously reset the clock on your tolerance, never allowing pattern recognition to reach the critical mass that would prompt you to leave. Trick 4. The comparison game, making you grateful for bare minimum. When she positions herself as better option than alternatives you could have, telling you about her friends' terrible relationships, pointing out how much worse she is than crazy exes you've had, noting how other women are more demanding or difficult than her, or generally framing herself as exceptional by comparison to worse options. She's not helping you appreciate what you have. She's manipulating your perception by anchoring your expectations to worst examples rather than healthy standards, making you grateful for a relationship that meets bare minimum, because at least she's not as bad as the horrible alternatives she's highlighting. What this reveals? This reveals manipulation of your comparison framework to lower your standards. When you compare her to healthy relationship standards, problems become obvious. When you compare her to worst-case scenarios she's selected, suddenly she looks acceptable. By controlling what you compare her to, she controls your assessment of whether relationship is good enough, steering your comparisons toward examples that make her look good rather than standards that would reveal inadequacies. Notice she selects the comparison examples strategically. If she tells you about friend's boyfriend who cheats but doesn't mention friends in healthy, supportive relationships, if she highlights your terrible ex but not your ex who treated you well, the selective presentation reveals she's curating your comparison set to include only examples that make her look good by contrast. Watch how she responds to positive relationship examples. If you mention couple who communicates well, or friend whose partner is particularly attentive, and she dismisses these as unrealistic, claims they're fake or rare, or finds ways to diminish positive examples, the resistance to healthy comparisons reveals she needs you comparing her to dysfunctional examples, not functional ones. Pay attention to whether gratitude is requested or demanded. If she explicitly asks you to appreciate that she doesn't do X terrible thing, or points out you should be grateful she's not like Y awful person, the explicit demand for gratitude for bare minimum reveals she knows what she's offering isn't actually good. It's just less bad than worse cases she's highlighting. The psychological trap. The trap works because humans assess satisfaction through comparison. If she controls your comparison framework, she controls your satisfaction. By continuously feeding you examples of worse relationships, worse partners, worse behavior, she trains you to evaluate her against bottom tier rather than healthy standards. You become grateful she only lies sometimes, instead of recognizing lying shouldn't happen at all. Trick 5. The potential projection, getting credit for who she could be. When she acknowledges her flaws but frames them as temporary obstacles she's actively working to overcome, admits she has issues with communication, commitment, honesty, or reliability, but emphasizes she's growing, changing, becoming a better version of herself, and you find yourself giving her credit and patience based on who she says she's becoming rather than who she actually is right now, she's not honestly sharing her growth journey. She's getting you to invest in her potential rather than her reality, accepting present dysfunction because you're focused on future version she claims to be working toward that never quite arrives. What this reveals? This reveals manipulation through selling potential to excuse present inadequacy. By acknowledging flaws while claiming to be actively changing, she achieves multiple goals, appears self-aware, which makes her seem emotionally mature, avoids accountability for current behavior because she's supposedly working on it, and secures your continued investment because you're waiting for improved version. Meanwhile, actual change is minimal or non-existent because acknowledgement of needing change is sufficient to maintain your patience. Notice whether claimed growth has timeline or evidence. If she's been working on same issue for months without visible progress, if there's no concrete evidence of effort to change, therapy, books, actual behavioral experiments, or if timeline for improvement keeps extending, the lack of real progress reveals growth talk is excuse-making rather than genuine change process. Watch whether she takes responsibility or blames circumstances. If her flaws are always explained by stress, past trauma, current circumstances, or other external factors, and growth is framed as something that will happen when conditions improve rather than active work she's doing now, the externalization reveals she's not actually taking ownership of change. Pay attention to whether you're investing based on present reality or future promise. If you're tolerating behavior now because you believe she'll change later, if you're staying because of who she could be rather than who she is, you're being manipulated through potential projection. People deserve patience for growth, but not infinite patience for promised growth that never materializes. The psychological trap. The trap works because you want to believe in growth and don't want to give up on someone working to improve. Once you've bought into her potential, leaving feels like abandoning someone right before they succeed at change. She exploits this by keeping you perpetually in the almost there phase, where change is always imminent enough to justify more patience, but never actually arrives enough to validate your investment. Trick 6. The Darvo response, reversing victim and offender roles. When you address her problematic behavior and she responds by denying the behavior happened, attacking you for bringing it up, and reversing victim and offender roles. So suddenly you're apologizing to her for daring to raise concerns about her actions, turning every attempt to address issues into a situation where you end up comforting her and apologizing for making her feel bad about hurting you. She's not emotionally processing legitimate concern. She's deploying sophisticated manipulation tactic that prevents accountability by making the cost of raising concerns higher than the cost of accepting bad behavior. What this reveals conscious or unconscious use of manipulation to avoid accountability. Darvo works because it's psychologically disorienting. You started conversation seeking acknowledgement of harm. You end conversation apologizing for raising issue and comforting person who harmed you. This reversal trains you to stop raising concerns because doing so is punishing rather than productive. She maintains freedom to continue problematic behavior because addressing it has become too psychologically costly for you. Notice the pattern. Deny, attack, reverse. If you point out she lied and she says you're misremembering, deny, you're being controlling by questioning her, attack, and she's hurt that you don't trust her, reverse. You've experienced full Darvo sequence. The systematic progression reveals practiced manipulation rather than organic emotional response. Watch how you feel after these conversations. If you entered seeking acknowledgement and ended apologizing, if you started hoping for change and ended doubting yourself, if you began with legitimate concern and finished feeling guilty for having that concern, the emotional reversal reveals successful Darvo manipulation. Pay attention to whether issues ever get resolved. If pattern is that you raise concern, conversation gets derailed into her feelings about you raising concern, original issue never gets addressed, and nothing changes, the consistent derailment reveals the response serves to prevent accountability rather than resolve problems. The psychological trap. The trap works because most people aren't familiar with Darvo and don't recognize they're being manipulated. You experience psychological whiplash as you go from addressing legitimate concern to apologizing for having that concern. Over time, you stop raising issues because you've learned that doing so results in you feeling worse rather than situation improving. She's successfully trained you that your best option is accepting her behavior rather than challenging it. Trick 7. The intermittent reinforcement, random rewards for consistent investment. When the relationship oscillates unpredictably between wonderful and terrible, sometimes she's affectionate, attentive, and amazing, giving you glimpses of incredible potential, while other times she's cold, distant, or problematic, and you can't predict which version you'll get or what triggers the switches. She's not being inconsistent due to mood swings or external stress. She's creating intermittent reinforcement pattern that's psychologically addictive, keeping you invested through unpredictable rewards that make the good moments feel more valuable because they're rare and make you constantly work to get back to those highs. What this reveals? This reveals manipulation through variable reward schedule that creates psychological addiction. Intermittent reinforcement is most powerful reinforcement schedule for creating lasting behavioral patterns. It's why gambling is addictive and why unpredictable relationships are hard to leave. When rewards are unpredictable, you stay engaged, constantly seeking next reward, working harder to earn uncertain outcomes than you would for guaranteed ones. She maintains your maximum investment through minimum consistent output. Notice you can't predict what causes good or bad treatment. If you try being more attentive, and sometimes it makes her warmer, sometimes colder, if you give her space and sometimes she appreciates it, sometimes resents it, the unpredictability reveals the variable response isn't about your behavior. It's about maintaining your uncertainty and therefore your continued effort to figure out what works. Watch how strongly the good moments affect you. If the rare times she's affectionate feel intensely meaningful because they're so uncommon, if you feel desperate relief when she's finally treating you well after a period of coldness, or if you work hard to prolong good moments because you don't know when next one will come, the intensity reveals intermittent reinforcement has created psychological dependency. Pay attention to whether bad behavior has consequences. If she can be cold, dismissive, or hurtful, and then win you back with single good moment or loving gesture. The lack of real consequences for bad behavior reveals she's learned she can take you for granted because intermittent good moments are sufficient to reset your tolerance and erase memory of bad treatment. The psychological trap. The trap works because your brain is wired to find patterns and seek rewards. With unpredictable relationship, you become like person at slot machine. You keep investing time, emotion, effort, seeking the reward, her good treatment, and the unpredictability makes the reward more compelling rather than less. You stay not despite the inconsistency, but because of it. Constant hope that next interaction will be good, one keeps you perpetually engaged and tolerant of bad treatment.